In the dead of night over the southern Caribbean, U.S. radar screens lit up with a ghost. A massive metallic shape drifted across the sea, moving slowly but giving off almost no signal. No civilian transponder, no shipping ID, nothing. On satellite images, its surface gleamed with strange plating, more like a floating fortress than any cargo vessel. Yet it sailed in silence, escorted by no flag. Its decks dark, its communications cut. For American commanders, the mystery was intolerable. This was no routine smuggler's ship. Its hull measured more than 7,000 tons, large enough to hide an arsenal. The vessel showed odd defensive structures. Gun mounts, radar towers, and infrared scans revealed faint human heat signatures trapped deep inside. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like a steel island drifting through black water. Moments later, orders rippled across the U.S. Southern Command network. Surveillance aircraft vectored closer, naval escorts adjusted course, and strike packages went on standby. Something hidden in that fortress was about to be exposed. But the question was larger than the ship itself. What secret lay inside this floating stronghold, and why did Washington decide it had to act immediately without waiting for another dawn? In the Southern Caribbean, U.S. intelligence tracked a cargo freighter unlike any merchant vessel. Its hull was reinforced, its compartments sealed like magazines, and its deck bristled with structures resembling weapon mounts. Analysts concluded it was no ordinary ship, but a floating base for organized crime. From Washington's perspective, this was not just smuggling, it was escalation. The ship bore the fingerprints of Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan cartel that had evolved beyond gangs and street cells into something resembling a paramilitary force. Reports from international watchdogs had already linked the organization to more than 2,000 murders and at least 3,500 human trafficking cases. Its reach extended from Caracas to Bogota, Lima, and even Miami, controlling corridors of migration, extortion, and synthetic drug production. To allies, it was a shadow army. To U.S. officials, a terrorist network hiding behind the facade of criminal enterprise. Venezuelan authorities, however, issued denials. In Caracas, spokesmen claimed the ship was civilian and accused Washington of manufacturing a pretext for intervention. The contradiction only deepened the tension. If the vessel truly belonged to an independent cartel, why did the government rush to distance itself? If it was state-linked, the implications could spiral into regional confrontation. The intelligence picture hardened with every pass of American satellites. Reconnaissance photographs showed steel reinforcements on the hull, compartments shielded like magazines, and containers lashed beneath tarps. Signals intercepts picked up encrypted chatter, routed through irregular frequencies, neither commercial shipping bands nor ordinary naval codes. Analysts grew convinced that the ship carried both contraband and human cargo. To make matters worse, whispers emerged that dozens of civilians were being held aboard as forced laborers, an accusation that elevated the incident from smuggling to human rights crisis. The Southern Command assessed that allowing the ship to reach its destination would risk flooding the hemisphere with billions in narcotics while condemning innocent people to slavery. The debate in Washington shifted quickly. Some argued for a maritime cordon and warning shots. Others insisted that delay meant danger. Radar towers on the ship suggested the ability to coordinate escorts or even to fire upon patrols. In the end, one conclusion overrode the others. Containment was impossible. A surgical strike was the only option that would both prevent distribution of the cargo and offer a chance to free the captives. U.S. intelligence had already marked the vessel as a high-risk contact before it entered contested waters. To verify, a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite was tasked to follow its course across the Caribbean, relaying thermal imagery to the Joint Operations Center in Florida. On surface radar, it looked like an ordinary bulk carrier, but detailed scans told a different story. Compartments glowed with uneven heat, and reinforced steel doors appeared where cargo hatches should have been. Within minutes, analysts concluded this was no civilian freighter, but something far more dangerous. MQ-9 Reaper drones closed the net. From above 20,000 feet, their radars mapped antennae, turrets, and container layouts, while signal intercepts picked up short, encrypted bursts consistent with organized crime tradecraft. Imagery analysts matched several deck containers to chemical storage profiles. Electronic forensics hinted that civilians were confined in a stern compartment. What had been a contraband seizure morphed into a hostage rescue mission. Planners faced a stark choice. A surface blockade risked warning the crew and giving them time to move or destroy evidence. A conventional boarding exposed teams to fortified positions on a hull that looked modified for defense. Satellite and drone feeds suggested the ship's towers carried surveillance radar with up to a 60-kilometer sweep and improvised emplacements that could mount 30-millimeter guns. Firepower far beyond normal merchant traffic. Left unchecked, the vessel could slip into Venezuelan waters within 26 hours and vanish under territorial protection. The president was briefed before 9 a.m. Two options went to the table: continue surveillance and press diplomatically, or authorize a preemptive, combined drone and special operations strike. The former minimized immediate political fallout, but risked strategic loss. The latter promised decisive action with no retreat. Military judgment favored speed. Delay, they argued, would allow the cartel to set the terms of escalation. At 9:39, orders encrypted across command nets activated Operation Silent Current, carrier and littoral drones to initiate electronic suppression and precision strike on sensor nodes, with Navy SEAL teams standing by to board once defenses were neutralized. For operators watching the screens, it was unprecedented, using full military force against an organized crime floating fortress. Should Washington strike now, risking civilian peril, or wait and gamble with billions in drugs and dozens of lives? The decision came quickly. They would not wait. The sky over the Caribbean changed from velvet black to a lattice of tracking beams and flare streaks in less than a minute. At 9:40, carrier and littoral assets began to execute the choreography rehearsed 1,000 times in simulators. Suppression, shock, then seizure. First came the electronic curtain. EW packages from airborne platforms and shipboard suites threw out a rolling fog of noise across the frequencies the fortress used. Radios that had spoken in 3-second bursts went silent. GPS feeds oscillated. Radar returns smeared into ghosts. The point of the jamming was surgical, not indiscriminate. Deny the defenders the ability to coordinate while leaving channels the assault force controlled. Then the swarm arrived. 50 expendable UAVs, small, low signature, designed to ram or detonate on contact, dropped from standoff platforms and threaded the sea like a swarm of hornets. They used terrain-following profiles to hug the wave tops, minimizing radar exposure and denying gunners the easy leads they needed. Each carried a compact warhead and a packed suite of sensors. Some were pure kinetic strike bots. Others carried shaped charges to punch through steel plating. The first wave targeted the ship's sensory and command nodes, radar masts, communications towers, the visible emplacements that had betrayed the vessel's abnormal profile. Impact after impact lit the deck with controlled fury. Sparks, collapsing latticework, then controlled conflagrations where fuel lines and stores ruptured. The masts folded like toothpicks. Antenna farms were shredded. Onboard generators coughed and died. That was the objective. Cut the ship's eyes and voice so the defenders could not bring coordinated fire to bear on approaching helicopters and boats. But the explosions also sent shrapnel and blast into places nobody had truly known were occupied. Steel doors buckled, hatches jammed, and fires raced through tarped stacks of containers. Panic followed precision. From the deck of an unseen U.S. ship, MH-60 Blackhawks lifted into the smoky air. Mark V combat boats punched the water in hard, white wakes, their profiles low, their timing tight. 200 SEALs were staged, small unit teams trained for shipboard takedowns, breaching units with explosives and cutting tools. Close quarters fighters with suppressed rifles, medics carrying trauma packs ready for immediate triage. Boarding was brutal and clinical, with UAVs still peeling off to keep watch and mop up. Fast rope teams descended onto an aft superstructure already scorched by earlier hits. Others came in over the rail from Mark V ramps, surfacing amid spray and boiling foam. Breach teams used shaped charges and mechanical cutters to open reinforced doors. Doorways that had been designed to withstand storms were not built to stop determined combat engineers. Cartel fighters answered with everything they had. The ship's recorded habitability of militia-style defense manifested in quick, lethal bursts. 30mm cannons on improvised mounts, heavy machine guns trained from turreted strongpoints, and squads cycling belts of ammunition like men fighting for survival. RPGs were fired from the shadow of containers. The booms echoed like coastal thunder. At one point, a near miss rocked a boarding craft, sending spray over the faces of SEALs who had to steady their aim and continue. Close quarters on a freighter are a deadly maze. Narrow corridors, low overhangs, and metal that rings when struck. The SEAL teams moved methodically. Stack, enter, clear. Commands were short, clipped by bone-conductive headsets. Flashbang grenades neutralized pockets of resistance. A well-placed concussion separated a gunner from his mount, long enough for a team to rush and secure the position. Medics worked through smoke to treat both enemy and civilian wounds. The rules of engagement emphasized saving life where possible. Amid the chaos, the prioritized task was always the hostages. Intelligence had identified a stern compartment where civilians were held. A breach team fought through a corridor slick with fuel and ash, pried open a hatch, and released a tangle of exhausted, terrified people. Men, women, children, eyes wide, mouths dry. SEAL medics conducted rapid assessments while other operators established a perimeter and called in small unmanned surface vessels for extraction. The firefight did not relent simply because the hostages were found. The cartel's command cluster, what remained of it, attempted sporadic counterattacks to break the perimeter and flame the deck enough to force a withdrawal. But the combination of persistent UAV overwatch, accurate suppressive fire from supporting ships, and the close-in discipline of special operators turned the momentum. Over the next 26 minutes, the ship ceased to be an organized fighting platform. It became a scene of pockets of resistance, then surrender. When the smoke thinned and medics led survivors to waiting boats, the battlefield tally began to form. 9 cartel fighters killed in action in the initial strikes and boarding engagements. Well over 100 detained, bound, and secured. 42 civilians accounted for and extracted to safety. Fire teams continued a systematic search of cargo holds and sealed compartments to ensure no other captives remained. On the deck, amid scorched paint and the stumps of masts, operators found evidence of industrial-scale contraband. Tarps were flayed back to reveal pallets of drums and boxed containers. Evidence that whatever this vessel had been carrying, it was not destined for ordinary ports of call. As the assault concluded, a single, unsheathed question hovered over the scene. The combination of drone strike and special operations had worked, but at what cost to the wider campaign? If this was the model, a floating, armored logistics node, how many more such fortresses lurked undiscovered on trade routes? The assault phase was not finished when the decks fell silent. Taking control of a vessel this size required more than disabling radar and breaching the upper structures. The deeper the SEALs pressed, the more resistance they encountered, a reminder that the Tren de Aragua had not simply armored a freighter, it had converted it into a floating redoubt. From the outer catwalks, small arms fire still snapped in defiance. SEAL squads rotated suppressive bursts to keep gunners pinned, while breaching teams advanced stairwell by stairwell. Each compartment offered a fresh challenge: blocked doors welded shut, fuel spills that threatened to ignite, and choke points where defenders could concentrate fire. In the starboard corridor leading to engineering, cartel fighters had barricaded themselves behind stacked crates, firing blindly but forcing the SEALs to use smoke and flashbangs to dislodge them. On another deck, a group of SEALs ran into heavier opposition, improvised bunkers welded to the hull, where cartel enforcers wielded belt-fed PKMS. Even in the chaos, they fired in disciplined bursts, showing training not unlike paramilitary units. One team advanced under covering fire from a Black Hawk circling overhead. The helicopter's door gunners stitched accurate lines into the emplacement, allowing breachers to set a thermite charge that forced the defenders to scatter. The noise inside the ship was relentless. Grenade concussions echoed down steel passageways, magnified until operators could feel the percussion in their ribs. Every radio transmission was short, forced by the constant background roar of engines still running and fires crackling in compromised holds. Sweat mixed with salt water on their gear, fogging goggles and turning grips slippery. Yet discipline held. Pairs covered corners. Medics tagged and moved wounded. Sappers mapped structural vulnerabilities to avoid collapsing key bulkheads. In the stern section, resistance grew fiercest. This was where intelligence had suggested the civilians were being held, and cartel fighters seemed determined to block access. A vicious 10-minute firefight erupted at the approach to a sealed compartment, with defenders hurling Molotovs and improvised explosives. Several SEALs sustained burns and shrapnel cuts, but the push did not stall. A coordinated breach, with two shaped charges, finally opened the hatch. Inside were 42 hostages. Their condition shocked even hardened operators. Malnourished, bruised, some shackled to bulkheads. Several children clung to mothers too weak to stand. Immediate triage began. IV fluids, oxygen masks, hasty dressings, while security teams set up a defensive perimeter. Extraction became priority one. Outside, Mark V boats surged back to the ship's side. Ropes and ladders were lowered, stretchers hoisted, and civilians guided through smoke-filled air toward safety. Door gunners on the hovering Blackhawks laid down suppressive fire to keep remaining cartel shooters at bay. Within minutes, the first groups of hostages were transferred to waiting medical teams offshore. Yet victory was not assured. In the engineering bay, defenders attempted one last counterattack, trying to trigger a controlled scuttling of the ship to deny U.S. forces their prize. SEAL sappers neutralized the charges, but only after a frantic exchange in the narrowest of spaces, operators firing at muzzle flashes less than 10 meters away. The clash ended with 3 cartel fighters dead, their attempt at sabotage foiled. By the time the last hostage cleared the ship, the operation had shifted from combat to consolidation. Cartel gunmen who survived the firefights were rounded up in makeshift holding pens on the aft deck. Each was zip-tied, searched, and photographed before being transferred to custody. Over 120 combatants were detained in this way, an extraordinary number for what had begun as a single freighter encounter. With the human dimension secured, commanders gave the order to sweep for contraband. What SEALs and support personnel uncovered confirmed the worst intelligence estimates. Beneath tarps and inside sealed containers lay industrial quantities of methamphetamine precursors, barrels upon barrels, enough to synthesize 190 tons of finished product. That translated into 1.5 billion lethal doses, a figure that made even seasoned narcotics experts pause. Stacked nearby were shrink-wrapped pallets of U.S. currency, $450 million in cash, meticulously packed for laundering through offshore networks. For the operators, the find was staggering. This was not a smuggling run. It was a mobile treasury, a drug bank designed to sustain Tren de Aragua's empire for years. One SEAL, scribbling an evidence log, muttered into his recorder that the seizure represented the economic destruction of a criminal state. The discovery reframed the mission's strategic weight. What had begun as a hostage rescue now stood as the largest narcotics and cash seizure in maritime history. It explained the cartel's ferocity. The fortress had not only carried lives, but their financial lifeline. It also raised questions Washington could not ignore. If one floating fortress existed, were others already at sea, fueling networks across the hemisphere. As dawn broke, smoke continued to billow from the damaged mass, but the stars and stripes flew above the captured vessel, planted by a SEAL team leader as a signal to command. Every hostage was safe. 9 cartel fighters had been killed in the battle, and over 100 were shackled and awaiting transfer. Yet the true story was just beginning to unfold. The operation had achieved its tactical objectives, but its revelation suggested a wider war, one that might stretch far beyond a single ship. Destroying enemies was one task, dismantling their financial engines was another. Which, Washington now asked, was truly the harder battle? With the deck secured and the hostages safe, attention shifted to the cavernous holds of the captured vessel. Operators moved cautiously through the dim interior, illuminating the space with helmet-mounted lights. What the beams revealed was not the clutter of a cargo ship, but the architecture of a bank vault at sea. Rows of sealed containers lined both sides of the bay, their steel surfaces marked with coded stencils. Cutting torches and hydraulic spreaders were brought forward. Within minutes, doors buckled open and the contents spilled into view, barrels stacked 3 high, each labeled with chemical designators recognized instantly by narcotics specialists. The compounds were precursors, the raw feedstock for methamphetamine. Analysts on scene quickly tallied the scale. More than 300 tons of input material, enough to produce approximately 190 tons of crystal meth. On the street, that represented over 1.5 billion doses. Elsewhere, pallets wrapped in plastic gleamed under the floodlights. Layers of US dollars, shrink-wrapped into bricks, filled crate after crate. Quick sampling revealed genuine currency, not counterfeits. When counted, the total reached $450 million in cash, more than the annual budget of some small nations, now stacked floor to ceiling in the belly of a ship. The discovery stunned even the most seasoned operators. Cartel seizures on land were one thing. To find such volume afloat suggested a new doctrine. Tren de Aragua had engineered a floating financial hub, immune to border controls, able to shift both drugs and cash across oceans with reduced risk of interception. It was not smuggling in the traditional sense, it was strategic logistics, a maritime treasury capable of underwriting trafficking networks from the Andes to the Gulf Coast. The implications were grave. If this fortress had reached safe harbor, the narcotics produced could have triggered a new surge in overdose deaths across North America. Public health officials later estimated that even a fraction of the cargo could flood cities with cheap, highly potent meth, overwhelming hospitals and law enforcement. Meanwhile, the cash reserves would bankroll expansion, purchasing weapons, bribing officials, funding paramilitary cells across the hemisphere. In the eyes of US strategists, the cargo validated the decision to strike. The mission had not just neutralized a single ship, it had amputated a vital artery of cartel finance. Every dollar seized represented a bribe that would not be paid. Every barrel intercepted 1 million doses that would never reach the streets. The scale made clear why hesitation had not been an option. Yet the find also sparked sobering questions. If Tren de Aragua could convert a freighter into such a fortress, what prevented other organizations from replicating the model? Intelligence officials speculated that similar narco carriers might already be underway, hidden among legitimate shipping traffic. The precedent was chilling. Oceans as open highways for industrialized crime, shielded by plausible deniability until intercepted. Standing in the cargo bay, one SEAL commander summed up the mood in his report. This wasn't just a ship. It was a factory, a vault, and a prison all at once. The world would soon learn the numbers. 190 tons of meth, 1.5 billion doses neutralized, $450 million seized, 42 lives saved. But in the moment, the operators understood something more visceral. The fortress had been built not only of steel, but of arrogance, the belief that no state would dare challenge it on the open sea. That belief now lay shattered in the smoke above the Caribbean. Had America failed to act, where would this ocean-borne treasury have gone? And how many lives would have been consumed in its wake? The Caribbean revealed the wreckage of a criminal empire. What began as a strange radar contact ended with one of the largest maritime raids in U.S. history. The results were decisive. 42 hostages rescued, 9 cartel fighters killed, more than 120 captured. The cargo told the bigger story: 190 tons of meth, equal to 1.5 billion doses, and $450 million in cash. In one night, Washington had dismantled both the poison and the purse that fueled Tren de Aragua's rise. To America's leaders, it proved the cartel was no longer a gang, but a transnational threat, and the only answer was decisive force. For allies, the strike showed U.S. resolve to act before narco armies could entrench. For rivals, it sent a blunt warning: steel and secrecy offer no shield when Washington decides to strike. Yet one question lingers: had this raid broken the will of Tren de Aragua? Or will it drive cartels to build even greater floating fortresses in the future? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Military Power, your channel for uncovering the hidden battles shaping our world.